The one image I can't lay to rest is a scrap of pink wool breathing in the tree line 30 feet up where floodwater had once licked the branches. A child's sweater mended with heavy hand stitches swayed like it still remembered the small shoulders that warmed it. Wind moved through the firs in a hush, and for a long minute none of us spoke, just boots in wet duff and a single raven scolding from the ridge. Let me know where you're listening from, and share this if you believe remembering is the first step toward justice. Most evenings that fall our valley settled early. By 6 o'clock the sun slid behind the western ridge and the air cooled 10-12 degrees in minutes. Smoke curled from stovepipes' porch lights came on and highway noise thinned to the odd log truck rolling through at 45 miles an hour. That was our rhythm in Skykomish steady practical. The kind of place where you knew who'd left their rake leaning against the fence and which dog would nose your hand at the post office. My days were simple. Retired from the Forest Road crew, I split wood-filed notes for the county paper and kept one ear tuned to the weather radio for wind advisories. After dinner, my wife and I walked 2 blocks down to the river overlook, listened to the South Fork rush past, and named the colors in the sky as if the mountains were our family's living room wall. I met Torren and Calder at a diner booth over coffee that tasted like old pennies, and it didn't matter. He brought maps always. He'd fold a paper topographic quadrangle like it was a magic trick. Ridge lines, contour intervals, little blue threads of creek, and he'd ask me about road gates the way a carpenter asks about grain. He was the kind of young dad you notice because he listened when older folks talked, and he listened harder when it came to the woods. He had surveyor's patience and a fresh respect for rules pack layers. Tell someone your route turnaround before pride costs you a night. We ribbed him about the whistle on his lanyard, the kind you buy at the bait shop, and he'd laugh, touch the metal with a knuckle, and say, "Let 'em hear me if it comes to that." Jillian had a September smile, warm, a little wistful. On Thursdays, she took my wife's choir folder home to practice harmonies, and more than once she showed up at our door with a pie in one hand, and Nia tucked under the other arm like a bag of kindling. If church folks tease, it's because they love you. We teased her for keeping a teacher's tote in the car with stickers, tissues, and a fold-up umbrella as if the sky took attendance. She had a way of tidying what a day left scattered, and you felt easier just being in the same room. Nia was a small comet. She trotted across the diner in boots that announced each step, tangled curls escaping a ball cap, cheeks bright from October air. When she climbed onto the vinyl bench beside Torren, she always dragged her backpack up with both elbows and parked it carefully. You could learn a lot from the way that kid arranged her World Owl stickers, a pencil with a chewed eraser, 3 pebbles she swore were rain eggs, and a folded napkin that kept a cookie from touching anything else. If the bell on the diner door rang, she'd look up for a second and then go back to her drawing tongue, peeking at the corner of her mouth. That afternoon, she showed me a unicorn stitched on a little pajama top she carried around just in case. I asked why. She said, "Because sometimes the night gets cold." It was the sort of town where a ranger knows your coffee order. Lyle Grayson came through most mornings in his green jacket with the patch lifting at one corner, and he never sat unless he meant to stay an hour. We'd swap notes about downed limbs on the spur roads or which culvert was sulking, or how the river chew-walked its way into the alder stand below Johnson Creek. He had a habit of looking past you at the window while you talked like he was checking sky and tree line for whatever you had left out. Lyle had seen more than most. He never snorted at superstition. He just let facts arrive in their own time. October's first cold front has a particular smell in our hills, wet fur-old smoke and the iron scent of river rock. You feel it in your knuckles before you see it in the trees. That week, temperatures rolled from the high 50s in the afternoon to low 40s by evening, and the forecast crackled about a marine push and patchy fog at elevation. To folks who work timber or roads, that's nothing dramatic. Just a reminder that daylight runs short near mountains. Saturday morning, the Calders stopped by the hardware store for camp soap and a roll of nylon cord. Torren said they were renting a little cabin down Route 2 for the weekend, a quick stretch on Skyline and back before dinner. He carried a day pack the way a man holds a child's hand. Easy, careful, never forgetful. Jillian bought hot chocolate packets and a small lantern that looked like a toy. She smiled at the cashier and said, "Insurance." Nia pressed both palms on the glass candy case, studying the jawbreakers like a jeweler. When Torren told her she could pick one thing, she chose a cheap silver locket with a clasp so stubborn it took all three of us to set a picture inside. You remember little moments because they grow teeth later. In the parking lot, Torren retied one of Nia's bootlaces without making a big fuss. She wobbled on one foot and giggled when his knuckle tickled her ankle. Jillian locked the car and checked the trunk twice light jacket's thermos first aid kit. She slipped a pink scarf around her neck, tested the stretch of the knit, and tucked it into her coat as if she were tucking in a child at nap time. When we waved them off, it felt no different than watching a neighbor back down the driveway. We were used to hellos and goodbyes that meant what they said. Afternoons were never long enough once October hit. By 4, the ridge throws a shadow over town like a slow lid closing. I split a small round of spruce while the radio ticked through the football scores, then took the dustpan to the woodbox because a little tidiness steadies the mind. At 5:30, my wife slid a casserole into the oven and poured tea into thick mugs that keep their heat. We turned on the porch light not because we expected company, but because it's what you do out here, light the front step for anyone drifting home. Jillian called around 6 to say they'd finished their loop and were stopping by the cabin to warm up. Her voice carried the way voices do in cool air, clear thin with distance. She said they'd found a patch of mushrooms near a downed cedar that smelled like old pennies and rain, and she said Nia had learned to read the map key for parking areas by herself. It was small talk, comfortable, and I could hear Torren in the background teasing Nia about who got the last of the trail mix. We wished them a quiet night. Wind came up a little before 7. You learn the sound of it in this valley, not a howl, not yet just a confident push through the top of the firs and a light rattle at the gutters. I stepped out to check the tie on the tarp that covers the stacked rounds and was struck by the way the air smelled. Clean-edged. A few leaves fretted across the driveway like mice. Somewhere down the block, a screen door thumped and then thumped again gentler, as if the second time might teach it manners. Just after 7:30, my wife asked if I'd seen the ridge. We stood in the street for a minute, warm mugs cupped like lanterns, and watched cloud move over the shoulder of Beckler Peak, thin sheets sliding fast. Our neighbor's golden retriever lifted his head as if listening for something beyond human hearing. The kind of night I remember thinking where you touch the thermostat up 2 degrees and carry the extra quilt out of the cedar chest just in case. The mountains didn't look angry. They looked occupied. Jillian is the sort who keeps track of details without announcing it. She liked to make sure our church secretary had the right dates for the chili supper, and that Mrs. Fraser's name was spelled correctly on the prayer list. That evening, she mentioned she'd left a casserole on low and asked if we needed anything from the store in the morning. She always thought in errands, which is how small towns keep the lights on. I told her we were set, and she said, "Good then, I might catch up on those reading logs before bed." It was a tidy plan. If you wrote the scene for a movie, it would look too calm, too sure of itself. I remember my last errand of the night because it didn't amount to anything. I took the trash out and paused at the curb listening. Trucks had thinned. The river rode its constant line. Across from us, the marshal's porch bulb flickered once, then steadied. I told myself I'd fix it for them on Monday. When I stepped back inside, my wife had set the table and was laying napkins that didn't match on purpose because she liked the homemade look. We ate with the ease that comes from 1,000 meals shared. I rinsed the dishes. She stacked them to dry on the old bath towel we use for everything. A small thing, I checked my pocket for the pen I keep clipped to the spiral notebook by the phone. It wasn't there. I looked on the hall table under the newspaper and finally found it on the dryer where I'd left it after folding a sweatshirt. When I came back to the living room, the clock on the wall ticked in that slow, good way that tells you life is moving as it should. If you've never loved a quiet house, you might think that sounds like nothing. To me, it feels like a promise kept. We keep the porch light on till 9 most nights. It's an old habit. When our boy was younger and worked late at the station, my wife said she could breathe better if the light was burning. At 8:15, I walked to the front window and looked down the block out of nothing more than routine. Headlights swept through once, then vanished. The street settled again, empty, but not lonely. I reached up and touched the glass. Cool. Out in the dark, the firs made that long, whispering sound like someone smoothing a blanket. A minute later, the phone on the hall table buzzed against the wood, then went still. A wrong number, maybe, or a pocket dial. I didn't get to it in time, and when I picked up, the line was clear as cold water. I set the receiver down and rubbed the place at the bridge of my nose that always tightens when weather rolls in. I told myself it was nothing. The town was as it should be. The mountains were exactly where we left them. The porch light kept its yellow circle on the steps. A patch of fog drifted across the road like breath on a mirror, and then thinned. I set the lock, not turned, just settled and stood for a second with my hand on the knob. Out back, a single pine cone fell from somewhere in the dark and clicked against the deck boards. I listened harder than the sound asked me to. Then I switched off the lamp in the living room, left the porch light burning a little longer than usual, and waited for a car I expected to see. That night settled over the valley like wet wool. I remember standing at the kitchen window with the porch light still burning, watching fog drift across the road in thin white ribbons. The Calder's cabin sat about 9 miles up Route 2 near the Skyline trailhead. Out there, once the sun goes down, the dark isn't gradual, it's total. I figured they'd turn in early roast a few marshmallows, maybe listen to the creek through the walls. But around 10, when the radio chatter from the ranger station crackled with a weather advisory light rain turning to sleet above 4,500 feet, I felt a small pinch of worry. Not the kind you speak aloud, just a knot behind the ribs that says, keep the light on a little longer. By midnight, the knot had turned to a stone. The phone rang once, then stopped. I told myself it was nothing wind on a line. Maybe the old exchange acting up again, but when I went to check, I saw a truck easing up my street with its hazards flashing. Ranger Grayson climbed out, face drawn tight under the brim of his hat. His headlights washed over our porch, painting my wife's wind chimes silver. He didn't waste time. Jillian called it in, he said. They're overdue. Been gone since yesterday morning. The way he said it, quiet but certain, told me this wasn't a case of wrong turn and late dinner. We loaded into his truck with thermoses and flashlights. The ride up the mountain was slow wipers, keeping rhythm against the rain. The forest looked alive in that strange way it does at night. Black trunks moving in the beam, every branch holding its breath. When we reached the trailhead, 2 volunteer rigs were already parked, engines ticking. Jillian stood in the gravel lot wrapped in a blanket, hair-wet eyes hollow. She didn't cry, just held Nia's pink scarf in both hands like a prayer rope. He said they'd be back before dark, she told Lyle. Her voice cracked once and then steadied. He always keeps his word. The first search went by the book. We started where Torren's car sat neat and locked keys in the glove box. Inside were 2 empty cocoa packets, a folded park brochure, and a paper map with a line traced in pencil Skyline Trail loop to the ridge and back. He'd written the date and time at the top, the kind of thing a man does when he wants order in the wilderness. We called their names every 100 feet, the echoes bouncing off trees that swallowed sound. The dogs caught nothing but squirrel scent. By 3 a.m., mist turned to drizzle. Flashlights cut thin cones through the fog, lighting only what was directly ahead enough to keep us moving, never enough to understand. At dawn, the clouds broke just enough for us to see the slope below. Pine needles shone slick as fish scales. Down by a creek bend, we found a single water bottle resting upright in the mud. Same brand Torren always carried, label half peeled. That was the first glimmer of hope, and we needed it badly. But when we widened the grid around it, there was nothing. No tracks, no dropped gear, not even the usual bent ferns that tell you someone passed. It was as if the forest had healed over behind them. By mid-morning, more volunteers arrived from Skykomish and Leavenworth. Locals who knew the terrain, plus a few hikers who just wanted to help. I stayed on as ground support, relaying coordinates from Lyall's radio to the command tent. Every call crackled with static. Every report ended with the same 2 words. No sign. The smell of coffee mixed with pine and diesel as more generators fired up. Jillian refused to leave base. She kept a photo of Torren and Nia propped against her thermos, checking it every time someone returned from a search line as if the picture might change. When she finally did speak, it was to me. He'd never go off trail, she said. Not with her. He knows better. I didn't have an answer that sounded like comfort. That day blurred into night, then into the next. Helicopters swept the ridges. Infrared picked up nothing but deer. The Forest Service widened the radius to 5 miles, then 10. Each new map looked cleaner than the one before. No fresh leads, no tracks. The sheriff's deputy called it a mystery. Lyall called it unfinished work. By the 4th day, official crews scaled back. Mountain searches are cruel. Like that, resources fade faster than hope. But Jillian stayed. I'd drive up in the evenings with supplies, canned soup, dry socks, letters from folks back home, and she'd meet me at the gate, eyes red but focused, asking what the weather looked like at higher elevation. Weeks passed that way. Winter pressed in early that year, icing the roads before Thanksgiving. Posters went up on gas station doors, Torren's face beside Nia's, the kind of flyer you can't look at for long. Around Christmas, the talk in town changed from search to search memorial. People still said poor Jillian, but they said it softer, like it belonged to the past. I tried to write something for the county paper, a short piece about staying safe in the backcountry, but every sentence felt like a betrayal. Nothing about this was tidy enough for print. 17 months. That's how long the silence lasted. Long enough for the Calder's cabin to be rented by new families, for the trail signs to fade another shade of brown, for winter to come and go twice. Then one morning in the fall of 2005, the call came down from dispatch. A hiker had found something off the main trail fabric high in a tree, bright colors against the green. Lyall was first on scene, and he asked if I could join with the recovery kit. I remember the drive more than the destination. The road curved through fog so dense it felt alive, like we were moving through someone else's breath. The hiker name was Jared Youngguy, with a camera, stood pale and shaking by the ridge when we arrived. He pointed up, hand trembling. I saw it right away. A blue jacket, a pink scarf, and what looked like a child's backpack hanging from a moss-covered branch maybe 30 feet up. The wind shifted and they swayed together, deliberate, almost arranged. For a second, no one spoke. Then Lyall said, "Mark, this. No climbing till forensics sees it." His voice was all business, but I could see the muscle ticking in his jaw. Jillian came later that afternoon. When she saw the scarf, her knees gave out. I caught her by the arm, but she pulled free and stared up until her eyes watered from strain. "That's hers," she whispered. "That's my baby's." The forest held perfectly still as if listening. Even the birds had gone quiet. The techs bagged each item with care, laying them on clean tarps under the canopy. The backpack was small purple, worn at the seams with a sticker of a cartoon owl on the flap. Inside were a few pebbles, a broken pencil, and a folded scrap of paper. It turned out to be a piece of map torn from one of Torren's survey sheets, with a faint X marked near a ridge 5 miles off the main trail. That single mark changed everything. Lyall studied it under his flashlight, turning it in his hand. He left this for someone to find, he said half to himself. The next morning, he organized a small team, 6 of us, with ropes, GPS, and K9 units to follow the coordinates. The climb was brutal, slick roots, loose shale fog that refused to lift. Jillian insisted on coming despite every warning saying she'd walk behind the dogs and keep quiet. She tucked Nia's scarf into her waistband like a flag. I won't forget that image, her small frame against the wall of evergreens, each step a fight between hope and exhaustion. Around noon, we caught the faint smell of old smoke. Lyle raised his hand and we stopped. The wind carried it downhill, a campfire, long dead, maybe months gone, but distinct. We followed the scent to a small clearing that looked wrong from the start, trees bent in odd directions, ash in the soil, a handmade shelter half hidden under brush. The lean-to sagged against a boulder patched with a tarp shredded by weather. Lyle crouched, motioning for the medic to move in first. Inside, we found the remains of a man curled toward the opening, one arm stretched out as if reaching for daylight. His jeans were stiff with mud boots, worn through a compass rose tattoo faint on his forearm. No one spoke for several minutes. You could hear rain clicking off the tarp and the soft static of Lyall's radio waiting for words that wouldn't come. When the medic finally broke the silence, her voice was low. Adult male, maybe mid-30s, likely hypothermia. Lyle closed his eyes just once, then opened them and nodded. "It's him," he said. Jillian sank to her knees beside the boulder. She didn't scream. She just pressed a hand to the dirt fingers spread and whispered something only the mountain could hear. We worked slowly, cataloging every scrap, a broken watch frozen at 4:17 p.m., a crumpled energy bar wrapper, and half a dozen small bones in the leaf litter that turned out to be animal. When the dogs began whining toward the far edge of the bowl, we followed and found a shallow depression lined with smooth river stones. The soil was loose, rain-softened. It looked like a child's grave, only there was nothing inside, no remains, no fabric, only a hollow and a few wildflowers pushing through. Jillian covered her mouth, tears spilling between her fingers. One of the handlers murmured something about scavengers, but Lyle shook his head. "Not this clean," he said. She moved, or someone moved her. That night we pitched tents nearby. Jillian refused to leave, sitting by the creek with her back to the fire, eyes fixed on the slope above. Around midnight, Lyle joined her. I watched from a distance, their silhouettes small against the moonlit granite. He handed her something from his pocket, the silver locket Torren used to wear. "He marked that X for you," I heard him say. "He wanted you to find her." The next morning, the search widened again, this time downstream. The forest felt different, heavier. Every sound carried meaning. A twig snap, a crow's call, even the distant crack of a falling branch. By midday, one of the dogs alerted near a root ball where the creek bent hard to the east. Buried in the silt was a child's boot, pink laces, frayed sole packed with red clay from the lower valleys. The kind of detail that makes or breaks a theory. We logged the find and traced the flow pattern downstream, noting debris caught in branches 10 feet up from the last flood. Lyle looked at the ridge, then at the creek. "She followed water," he murmured, "just like he taught her." The discovery didn't bring relief, only more questions. The forensic guys would later say the jacket and scarf in the trees had been hung deliberately, not washed up. Maybe Torren was signaling aircraft, maybe leaving markers in case she circled back. Whatever the intent, the mountain had rearranged everything after he died, flood snow animals' time. We were chasing ghosts through a moving landscape. By the end of that week, the official story was that Torren died from exposure after a fall. But anyone who stood in that hollow knew it wasn't finished. Somewhere beyond those granite walls, a little girl had kept walking. Whether she'd found help or vanished deeper into the green, none of us could say. As we packed camp, Jillian knelt one last time where the creek began its drop toward the valley. She touched the cold water, then looked up at the trees swaying above us. "If she's out there," she said softly, "she knows we're coming." The wind rose, bending the tops of the firs, till they whispered like voices far away. We followed the stream down, boots slipping in the red clay, the sound of rushing water growing louder with each step. Somewhere ahead, unseen beyond the bend, another clue waited in the current, something small enough to miss but heavy enough to hold a story. The creek wound deeper into the gorge, pulling us with it like a current you can't fight. Each step sank into red clay that clung to our boots and filled the air with the smell of wet iron. The noise of the water grew louder until it swallowed every voice, every thought. We followed the pink boot downstream, convinced it wasn't just debris carried by floodwater, but a trail left on purpose, or maybe the last thing the mountain hadn't yet buried. By afternoon, the fog thinned, showing steep walls rising 30 feet high on either side, sheer rock streaked black by years of rain. Lyle called for a halt. His voice had gone rough from days of cold air and too much coffee, but he never raised it. He just pointed to a scar on the far bank where mud had collapsed in a fresh slide. The dogs strained against their leads, noses, low tails, stiff. Marcos, the handler, nodded once and said, "They smell something." We climbed down in silence. The mud sucked at our boots, and every movement sounded like the earth itself, breathing. The first thing I saw was metal, a child's sandal buckle, rusted but still shaped like a starfish. It had been caught in a tangle of roots. Marcos pulled it free and held it up to the light. Jillian was above us on the ridge, watching every move. "Does it match?" She called, her voice echoing against the stone. Lyle didn't answer right away. He just turned the buckle in his gloved hand, then looked up and gave a slow nod. Jillian covered her mouth. Even from that distance, I could see her shaking. She'd sewn those sandals herself the summer before when Nia kept losing shoes in the yard. It wasn't just a clue, it was a piece of her. We bagged the buckle and kept moving. The creek curved right, narrowing into a canyon so tight we had to pass gear hand to hand through the slots. The air grew colder as sunlight vanished, replaced by the glow of our headlamps. Every wall dripped. The sound of the water changed from steady rush to short bursts against rock, like the mountain had learned to whisper. After another 100 yards, the dogs froze again, hackles high. This time it wasn't something in the mud, it was above us. A scrap of fabric had caught in a deadfall about 15 feet up. The color was faded, but under the beam of my light I saw a faded unicorn embroidered in silver thread. Lyle's breath fogged in front of him. "Get a rope," he said quietly. The fabric tore when I tugged it loose. It wasn't weathered enough to be old. You could still smell faint detergent under the earth and rain. I turned it over and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the canyon. The unicorn was stitched on flannel, part of a child's pajama top. Jillian's pajama top, the one Nia had shown me in the diner, proud of the sparkly thread. She'd said, "It keeps nightmares away." I don't know why, but I folded it before handing it to Lyle. He looked at it for a long time, then whispered, "She made it through here. After him." Back at camp that night, the evidence sat on a tarp boot buckle flannel. Forensics took samples while the rest of us tried to stay warm. Jillian sat by the fire, Nia's scarf knotted around her wrist, her eyes fixed on the flames like she could read her daughter's story in the embers. The text said the fabric showed signs of both water and air exposure, washed through floods, then dried in open air. That meant it hadn't been buried. It had been hung or placed. Lyle rubbed his hands together slowly, his mind working behind his tired eyes. "He hung the jacket and scarf high," he said mostly to himself. Maybe she did the same, following his lead. It was a theory, but one that carried more mercy than the others. The next morning we started early, moving down the eastern fork where the flood had carved a new path years earlier. The mud here was redder, thicker, almost oily. Every few hundred feet we found remnants of the storm branches twisted into knots, pieces of old tarp's bones from deer washed down from higher slopes. The higher we went, the older the forest felt like time slowed under that canopy. Jillian trailed close behind, quiet, except for her boots crunching through the underbrush. At one bend, she stopped and pointed to a tree trunk on the far side of the creek. I crossed over and froze. There, cut into the bark with a small knife, were 2 letters N and C, and below them a rough arrow pointing east. The cuts were shallow, but the wood beneath was still pale, not yet darkened by weather. Jillian stepped forward, tracing the grooves with a trembling hand. "That's her writing," she said. "That's how she made her letters." Her voice cracked, but there was a small spark behind it now, a fragile hope that hadn't been there before. Lyle knelt to take photos, his face unreadable. "Fresh enough to be spring," he murmured. She was alive after the thaw. It was almost impossible to grasp a 6-year-old surviving alone through winter. But the forest doesn't always play by human rules. It shelters some. It swallows others. We followed the direction of the arrow through younger growth where old logging roads had once been. The ground was uneven, littered with broken glass and rusted cans from decades past. Every step forward felt like stepping into another life, someone's campfire long gone cold, the ghosts of machinery buried under moss. Around noon, we caught the faint smell of smoke. Not campfire old, but recent charcoal fat and something faintly sweet like burning pine resin. Lyle signaled for silence. The wind shifted, carrying the scent downhill. We moved single file, crouched low until the forest thinned and sunlight broke through. The clearing looked like something time had forgotten. An old shack slumped against a nurse log, its roof patched with sheets of tin and plywood smoke curling from a stone-ringed pit in front. A few chickens pecked at the dirt near a pen made of scavenged wire. The place was alive in the rough way of folks who'd decided the world no longer had much to offer them. Lyle motioned for us to stay back and called out Forest Service. "Anyone home?" The door creaked open, and a woman stepped out, lean and sun-weathered, an axe hanging loose in one hand. Her hair was streaked gray, pulled back with a bandana. She looked at us without fear, just calculation, like she'd seen this kind of moment before. "Who's asking?" she said. Lyle kept his tone even. "Ranger Grayson. We're looking for a missing child. Little girl, dark hair, about 7 years old now. You seen anyone out here?" The woman's eyes flicked to the shack behind her. Just once. Quick but enough. Jillian saw it too. She pushed past us before anyone could stop her voice breaking as she called Nia baby. "It's Mom." The sound hung in the air like a struck bell. For a moment, nothing moved. Then from inside the shack came the smallest sound, a scrape of wood, then stillness. The woman's shoulders slumped. She set the axe down and said quietly, "Don't scare her. She's inside." I'll never forget the way Jillian walked to that door. Slow, like approaching a deer, afraid one sudden move might send it running. When she pushed it open, the smell of smoke and herbs filled the air. Inside, on a pallet of old blankets, sat a child, thin hair, tangled, eyes too old for her face. She looked up at the light and froze. For a second, she didn't seem to recognize anything human. Then Jillian whispered, "It's me, sweetheart. It's Mom." The girl blinked, mouth trembling, and finally said one word. "Mama." The sound broke something loose in all of us. Lyle turned away, pretending to check his radio. Marcos knelt to unclip his dog's harness, giving them space. Jillian dropped to her knees and gathered the child into her arms, rocking her without a sound. I remember the way Nia clung to her small hands, gripping the fabric of her mother's jacket, as if testing whether this was real. The woman who'd been living there, her name was Dara Klein, told us her story while medics checked Nia's vitals. She said she'd been out gathering roots after the big flood that winter when she found the girl huddled in a hollow near the creek, half-conscious, holding a silver locket and whispering to herself. Dara took her in, fed her broth, kept her alive. Didn't trust calling anyone, she said, staring at the ground. "Got my own problems with the law. Figured I'd wait till the season turned, make it right then. But the seasons kept turning, and the right time never came." Nia sat beside Jillian, head resting on her shoulder, silent, except for small hums that didn't sound like words. Her hands were scratched, nails broken, but her heartbeat was steady. The locket was still around her neck. It opened easily, a picture of Jillian on one side, Torren on the other. I looked at Lyle and saw his jaw tighten. He marked that X for her, he said softly, and she found her way out. We radioed for evacuation at dusk. The helicopter came in low blades, chopping the air, scattering ash from the fire pit. Nia flinched at the noise but didn't let go of Jillian's hand. Dara stood off to the side, watching her face unreadable. When Lyle told her there'd be questions charges, maybe she nodded. "I know," she said. "But she's alive. That's what matters." As the chopper lifted off, I looked back at the clearing. The smoke from the fire twisted upward, caught in the downdraft, then vanished into the trees. I don't know what I expected to feel relief, maybe, but what settled in my chest was quieter, something closer to awe. After 17 months of silence, the mountain had finally spoken, and what it said was this: even in the worst corners of wilderness, someone had chosen mercy. We hiked out under a sky turning violet with evening. The forest had gone still again, as if resetting itself after bearing witness. Up ahead, Jillian's voice carried faintly through the static of Lyle's radio, soft words to a child rediscovering language. Behind us, Dara's shack faded into the distance, a ghost among the trees. When we reached the trucks, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain. Lyle paused, looking back toward the ridge. "There's more here," he said half to himself. "Always is." He was right. We'd found them, but the story wasn't done. The mountain never gives back without asking what you'll do with what it returns. The helicopter's blades were still beating the air when I felt the first drop of rain hit my neck. The forest had gone back to gray, the sound of its own breathing swallowing the roar of the rotors as they lifted Nia and Jillian out of that clearing. Dara Klein stood a few feet away, her hands loose at her sides, smoke rising from the half-dead fire between us. She didn't look scared, just emptied out like someone who had already paid for whatever was coming. Lyle approached her gently, keeping his voice level. "We'll need your statement," he said. She nodded once, eyes fixed on the sky where the chopper disappeared into the clouds. "You'll get it," she said. "I'll tell it all, but don't make it sound ugly." She wasn't a ghost out here. She was a girl who tried. Then she bent, doused the fire with a scoop of rainwater, and the smoke curled around her like fog closing a door. We made the long hike back in silence. The forest had changed since the morning. The air felt heavier, the color of everything dulled by exhaustion. My legs ached, but I couldn't stop thinking about the carvings on that tree, those uneven letters N and C, Nia's tiny handwriting still sharp in the grain. I kept seeing the little flannel patch folded inside the evidence bag, the faded unicorn smiling through the plastic. It struck me that every trace of that child's journey had been an act of faith, carving, hanging, leaving behind something bright in the dark. When we reached the trucks, the rain had picked up. Lyle climbed into the cab and radioed the command post. "Child recovered alive," he said. "Repeat, alive." The words didn't sound real. You could see the disbelief in everyone's faces, the medics, the handlers, even the deputies who'd seen their share of miracles gone wrong. The dispatcher asked for confirmation twice, voice shaking through the static. Lyle didn't repeat himself a third time. He just looked out at the trees, jaw tight, and let the radio go quiet. That night, the sheriff's office turned into a maze of movement phones, ringing reporters, calling federal folks arriving in pressed jackets, asking for statements none of us were ready to give. I sat on a bench outside, watching water drip off the awning. The scent of wet cedar clung to everything, even the papers in my hands. Jillian and Nia were at the hospital in Everett, guarded by half a dozen officers in case any curious cameras showed up. Dara was brought in an hour later, escorted by a younger ranger. She walked in with her shoulders squared, head high. You could tell she'd spent years living on her own terms. She wasn't about to bow to bureaucracy. When she saw me, she gave a small nod, almost polite, like we'd met at the feed store instead of a crime scene. Lyle came out a little later, soaked from the waist down his jacket, dark with rain. "They're stable," he said, settling onto the bench beside me. "Kid's malnourished, a little dehydrated, but she's talking now. Keeps asking where her daddy went." He paused, rubbing his face. "I told Jillian we'd get her answers, but hell, I don't know if that's true." I didn't reply. Sometimes words do more harm than silence. We sat there until the rain eased into drizzle and the world smelled clean again. Around midnight, a deputy brought us coffee that tasted like burnt bark, but it was warm. Lyle took a sip and said, "You ever wonder how people survive things they shouldn't?" I thought about it then, said, "Every day." The next morning, I drove out to the hospital. Jillian was sitting by the window of a private room, Nia curled against her side, eyes closed. The girl looked impossibly small against the white sheets. The nurse said she hadn't spoken much since they brought her in, only short, broken phrases. Jillian's hand moved in slow circles on her daughter's back. Her own eyes red-rimmed but steady. When she saw me, she smiled through exhaustion. "She's warm now," she said. "She's safe." That word safe hung in the air like a fragile promise. Later that afternoon, Lyle and I met with Dara again, this time in one of the small interview rooms at the station. The fluorescent light hummed overhead, giving the space a colorless feel. She wore the same threadbare flannel from the night before, her hands cuffed loosely in front of her. There was no fight in her, no guilt either, just a kind of resignation. "Tell us how you found her," Lyle said. Dara's eyes softened, the first emotion I'd seen in her since we'd met. "The flood had just started to drop," she began. "That creek you saw, it was angry back then. I was foraging for ginseng when I saw movement by a root hollow. Thought it was a coyote at first. Then I heard humming. When I got close, she was there, soaked through, shivering, holding that necklace, eyes open but glassy. Kept saying, 'Follow the water.' She looked down at her hands. I couldn't just leave her. So I carried her to the shack, fed her what I had, broth, rabbit mushrooms. She didn't speak for weeks. When she finally did, she called me the Lady of the Creek. I didn't know what to make of that. She smiled faintly. Guess to her I was some story come true." Lyle leaned forward. "Why didn't you call for help? I was wanted," she said plainly. "Couple old warrants. Nothing violent. I figured they'd take her and lock me up and she'd end up in the system. I thought I could get her strong first. Wait till spring." Her eyes filled but didn't spill. By spring, she didn't want to go. She'd built a garden out back named the Chickens after colors. We were something like a family. When she finished, Lyle nodded once. "You did what you thought was right." "I did what I could," she corrected. There was nothing more to say. She signed the statement, and when the deputies led her out, she looked back only once, not at us, but toward the window where a slice of forest showed through the rain. "Tell her," she said quietly, "that I never meant to steal her life. I just wanted to give her a chance to keep it." That night the town turned itself inside out with relief. The local news called it the Cascade Miracle. For the first time in months, the faces of Torren and Nia were side by side, not as missing persons, but as father and daughter reunited by faith and chance. But for those of us who'd seen the ridge, the lean-to, the carved letters in that tree, it wasn't a miracle, it was a debt paid in endurance. When Jillian and Nia came home 2 weeks later, the whole town lined Main Street. I stood near the diner where I'd first met them, hat in hand. Nia waved shyly from the back seat, hair-combed, cheeks still thin but brighter. Jillian rolled down the window as they passed. "Thank you," she mouthed. I shook my head. Some things don't belong to gratitude. They belong to fate. In the days that followed, I kept in touch with Lyle. He couldn't shake the feeling that parts of the story were still missing. Forensics had confirmed that Torren's map and the hung clothes were deliberate markers likely placed during his final days. The timeline suggested he'd survived for nearly a week after injury, long enough to teach Nia how to follow the creek, how to find food, how to carve her initials so someone might trace her path. But what we couldn't explain was how she'd lasted through that winter alone before Dara found her. There were no footprints in the old snow layers, no remnants of secondary shelter. Just absence. One evening, Lyle stopped by my porch with a folder under his arm. "Thought you'd want to see this," he said. Inside were copies of Nia's sketches from the notebook they found in Dara's shack. Crude drawings, stick figures under tall trees, a small fire, animals with names scrawled underneath. But one page stood out. It showed a man with a beard and hat standing by a stream holding something that looked like a stick or staff. Above him, she'd written one word. "Friend." "Could have been Dara," I said. "Maybe," Lyle replied. "But she swears she never wore a hat. We left it there." Some mysteries don't ask to be solved. That winter, Jillian rented a small place in town close enough to walk to the school where she'd started teaching again. Nia began sessions with a counselor who specialized in child trauma. Every once in a while, I'd see them walking to the library, Nia bundled in her mother's old coat, her small hand gripping Jillian's like it was the world's anchor. She didn't talk much to anyone else, but she smiled when she saw Lyle, and once, when she saw me outside the diner, she lifted her hand and traced a little circle in the air, the same way she used to spin her father's compass when she was a toddler waiting at our breakfast table. It felt like a message, though I couldn't say what. Months later, in the early spring, a package arrived at the ranger station. No return address. Inside was a single envelope wrapped in brown paper. On the back, someone had drawn a simple outline of a mountain peak and written 2 words, East Ridge. Inside, there was a tarnished bullet casing, a .38, round the same caliber as the revolver Dara kept in her shack, and a note in shaky handwriting that read, "She was brave. I saw." Lyle showed it to me that night, his hands steady, but his face pale. "We don't know who sent it," he said. "Could be nothing. Could be everything." He placed it back in the evidence bag, sealing it with care. Whatever truth's left out there, the forest's keeping it close. He was right. The Cascades are full of places where answers fade into moss and silence. I drove up once more that summer, parking by the old trailhead. The woods were alive again, birds calling new growth bright against old stone. I found the tree with the carved initials, though the arrow had almost disappeared under fresh bark. I stood there for a long time listening to the creek. Somewhere beyond it, unseen but present, was the ridge where a father died trying to save his child. A woman hid from the world and gave her shelter, and a little girl learned to live by her own light. As I turned to leave, wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and rain. For a moment, I thought I heard laughter, soft, high, and familiar. Maybe it was only memory, maybe not. Either way, I left the mountains knowing this much: some stories don't end where we find them. They just grow quieter, folding themselves back into the land until someone listens again. The Cascades changed after that year, though it took a long time for anyone to say it out loud. Folks in town still hiked those ridges, still cut firewood, and pitched tents along the same trails, but there was a kind of quiet to the way people moved through the woods now, like they were walking through someone else's memory. The storm that took Torren and Calder had left its own scars on the land. Deep cuts where the flood carved new paths, but it also left reminders that not everything is meant to stay buried. Jillian and Nia stayed in Skykomish through the spring. Their cabin up near the trailhead was sold off to some folks from Everett, but Jillian said she couldn't bear to be that close to the ridge. She rented a small place near the school instead, a single-story house with a view of the river. I helped her carry boxes one weekend. The light through her windows looked softer than it used to, filtered through curtains that smelled faintly of cedar. She told me she planned to start teaching full-time again come fall. "Routine helps," she said. "For both of us." Nia sat on the porch steps that day, drawing in a spiral notebook, the locket still hanging around her neck. She didn't talk much, but her presence had weight, like she understood more than any child should about how fragile a world can be. Dara Klein's hearing came a few weeks later in Seattle. Lyle and I sat in the back of the courtroom while she stood before the judge in a faded dress someone must have brought her from the jail. She didn't contest a thing: unlawful possession, failure to report a missing minor, the trespass charges from years before. Her voice stayed steady when she spoke. "I didn't plan to hide her," she said. "I planned to keep her alive." The courtroom was so still you could hear the shuffle of the bailiff's shoes against the tile. Jillian was there too. She waited until the sentencing was done, then walked up to Dara as the deputies moved to lead her away. I didn't hear what she said, but Dara's eyes filled and Jillian reached out and touched her hand before she was taken. Later, Jillian told me, "Whatever law says that woman saved my daughter." Dara served her time quietly, and by the time she was released, she'd vanished from the news cycle, choosing to live out near the Olympic foothills where no one would think to follow. Lyle told me he got a postcard from her a few years later, no return address, just a sketch of a cabin drawn in pencil smoke curling from the chimney. On the back, 3 words, "She's home now." Nia grew up fast in the years that followed. She stayed small for her age, always thin, but there was a steadiness to her that people noticed. When she spoke, it was measured, her voice soft but sure. She carried pieces of the wilderness with her spent afternoons cataloging rocks, sketching tree bark, tracing rivers on old maps. Lyle used to stop by on her birthdays with some trinket from the ranger station, a compass, a whistle, once a tiny carved bear he said had sat on his dashboard for a decade. Nia kept them all lined up on her bookshelf, little markers of a world she'd once fought through and somehow survived. The investigation into Torren's death wrapped up formally that summer. Official reports said he'd died from exposure and injury after a fall, but Lyle and I knew that line on paper didn't carry half the truth. His map, the clothes hung high in the trees, the X marked near that ridge, they weren't random. They were lessons left behind. Every sign he made was for her, and it worked. When people called him a victim, I couldn't bring myself to agree. He'd gone into those mountains as a father and left as a compass, one that pointed his child home. I still think about the night the anonymous envelope arrived, the one marked East Ridge. It came just after the snow melted, months after the case had closed. The .38 casing inside the note that read, "She was brave," I saw. There was something about those words that didn't feel like threat or confession, more like a testimony from someone who'd witnessed the last flicker of light in a dark place. The handwriting was shaky, like it belonged to old hands. Lyle filed it as evidence, but deep down we both knew it wouldn't lead to anything the courts could use. The forest had its own way of keeping accounts. By the 2nd anniversary of the rescue, a small bronze plaque appeared at the base of the Skyline Trail. Nobody claimed responsibility for it, though I suspect Lyle had a hand in getting it approved. It read, "In memory of Torren Calder, who marked the way." Hikers would stop and leave stones, bits of ribbon, or sometimes a child's toy. Every spring when the meltwater turned the streams wild again, that plaque caught the morning sun just right, flashing through the trees like a signal still working. As for Lyle, the search took something out of him that never quite returned. He kept on as ranger for a few more years, though he turned down every major search detail after that. He said it was time for younger legs. When he retired, he moved down to the valley, built a small place on an old mill lot, and spent his days fishing and writing letters he rarely mailed. He passed away last winter quietly in his sleep. Jillian and Nia came to the service. She laid a sprig of pine on his coffin and whispered something I didn't catch. Later, she told me, he never stopped looking. Even after we found her, he kept searching. I knew what she meant. Every few years, I hike back up that ridge, usually in late summer when the air is dry and the ground soft underfoot. The path has changed. Some storms, shifted routes push through. But if you know what you're looking for, the markers are still there. The spot where the lean-to once stood is almost invisible now, swallowed by ferns. but the soil feels different under your boots, packed harder like the ground remembers weight. A few yards away, where we found the hollow lined with river stones, there's a cluster of wildflowers that bloom earlier than the rest. I can't explain it, and maybe I don't need to. Sometimes when I reach the tree with Nia's initials, I stop and rest my hand on the bark. The letters have nearly vanished into the wood, but if you trace them just right, you can still feel the grooves. It reminds me that time doesn't erase what matters. It just folds it deeper into the living things that outlast us. I saw Nia again not long ago. She's in college now, studying environmental science. Said she wants to work in conservation, maybe wilderness safety. I don't remember everything she told me, just pieces. The sound of the creek, the smell of smoke, a woman's voice singing low. But when I hike now, I never feel afraid. Her eyes were steady when she said it, calm in that same way her father once was when reading the ridges on a map. Before she left, she handed me a small polished stone from her pocket, gray with a faint streak of red running through it. "Found this near the trail last week," she said. "I thought you'd want to keep it." I turned it over in my hand, and for a moment it felt like the mountains had exhaled something back into the world. There are stories that fade because they're finished, and there are stories that stay because the land keeps repeating them in its own language, wind through trees, water over stone. The Calder's story belongs to that second kind. It's part of the forest now, part of every boot print that presses against those trails, part of every parent who stops at dusk and listens a little longer before turning back. I still write about local cases now and then small-town tragedies that don't make the news, but this one sits differently. Maybe because it never truly belonged to law enforcement or headlines, it belonged to the bond between a father who refused to give up and a daughter who remembered how to listen. I think about that when storms roll over the valley and lightning splits the ridge. Somewhere up there, a line of light cuts through the dark, and I like to imagine it finding the places we missed, the ones we couldn't save, the ones that taught us what saving really means. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, not for credit, but so no one forgets the names carved into the bark or the small hands that survived because someone loved her enough to teach her how. The mountain gave them back, but only after it was sure we were ready to remember.